On a typical day, students shuffle from one classroom to another, armed with textbooks and a schedule that dictates when to study math, when to read poetry, and when to memorize historical dates. Yet amidst this structured dance, we lose out on the lessons on separating truth from fiction, the lectures on looking beyond the words on a page, and the units on navigating the maze of real-world problems. As students, you are often told what to learn, but how often are you taught how to think? In an evolving world brimming with information, yet rife with misinformation, the absence of critical thinking in education is not just an omission, it is a disservice to the potential of every student. Why are we, as students, not being given the tools to critically analyze the world around us when it is clear that the ability to think critically is not just a useful skill, but a necessary one? Based on this, I believe that critical thinking classes should be added to part of the core curriculum of American schools, and you should too. Today, I am going to first tell you about the problems students face today that could be fixed by teaching critical thinking, how critical thinking classes could be integrated, and the concrete evidence of the help they could provide, and then I will address some of the counter-arguments that may come to mind in those who feel differently. I'll begin by telling you about why we need critical thinking to be taught in schools. Think about what it was like for you to transition from your high school or college life into adulthood. One main thing that people often say is the difference is the lack of structure and disciplined organization outside of school. According to Dr. Kulvarn Atwal, a current executive head teacher of 2 large primary schools, in many classrooms I visit, students' primary focus is on what they are expected to do and how it will be measured. It seems that we are becoming successful at producing students who are able to jump through hoops and pass tests. In other words, the current education system is teaching students how to cater to teachers and how to answer multiple choice questions on a test rather than learning real skills or truly absorbing knowledge. The failure of schools to adequately prepare students for real careers in adult life is leading to a future generation who will be better suited to memorizing dates and names than problem solving and evaluating information. Being a student in 2021 is quite different from being one just a decade ago. Yet, in the span of 10 years, the world of education has witnessed little change. As the world keeps facing new challenges, especially due to COVID-19, younger generations, and the education system they are a part of, have been failing to keep up. The shift to remote learning and digital classrooms brought forth by the pandemic has only further highlighted the deficiencies in our educational approach. Students were suddenly thrust into an environment where self-regulation and adaptability were not just advantageous, but necessary for academic progress, yet many floundered. But this is not due to a lack of intelligence or dedication on the students, but because the skills needed to manage time, prioritize tasks, and learn independently from a structured format had not been part of their formal education. The education system, slow to pivot from its entrenched methodologies, found itself at a crossroads, needing to reconcile the traditional, structured classroom with the autonomy and flexibility demanded by the effects of the pandemic, and those of realistic careers in an ever-changing world. The result has been a call to action, to imagine education in a way that equips students not just for tests, but for the unpredictable and dynamic landscape of the real world. I am sure that you can now see how the world of academia and that of real adult careers could benefit from students being taught more autonomy through critical thinking classes. Now, let me show you the concrete evidence as to how this can help and how it can be implemented. In colleges, we have already made some progress towards the assessment of critical thinking skills with the CCTST, a test that measures cognitive and metacognitive skills associated with critical thinking, which can be used to support some of the assertions here about implementation into high school classes. Based on data collected from this test, released to the public by the National Library of Medicine, we can see that students who engage in critical thinking exercises within their biology courses in college demonstrated notable gains in their CCTST scores. This group, engaging in reflective writing exercises, experienced an average increase in CCTST raw scores by 1.18 points, which translates to a leap from the 45th to the 53rd percentile nationally. This rise not only underscores the direct impact of critical thinking activities on academic performance, but also reflects the potential for these skills to translate into improved job performance. As Murawski elucidates, critical thinking in the workplace is paramount, with the 2007 study for Human Resource Management report highlighting that employers value critical thinking and problem solving over other skills. Furthermore, as Mamta Singh, of QMHS teachers articulates, critical thinking is self-disciplined and self-corrective, which aligns with workplace expectations for autonomy and adaptability. These findings advocate for a systematic integration of critical thinking into the curriculum, preparing students not only for academic success but also equipping them with competencies essential for their future careers. The implication is clear. When education systems invest in the development of critical thinking, they are not only bolstering academic success but are also equipping students with the analytical acumen essential for the workforce. Such evidence solidifies the argument for incorporating critical thinking into the core curriculum, as it is demonstrably beneficial in bridging the gap between academic achievement and real-world application. A report by Lyer-Lennon asserts that critical thinking is self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective, which is in line with the CCTST test's objective to measure cognitive and metacognitive skills associated with critical thinking. Lennon highlights the significance of critical thinking in education, suggesting it is not only vital for students' academic success but also for their future potential professional endeavors. This aligns with the findings from Quintadamo and Kurtz, where students engaged in critical thinking activities showed measurable improvements, evidenced by their percentile rank increase on the CCTST, supporting the claim that critical thinking development is essential for adapting to the complexities of real-world problems and professional environments. Cold. You can now see that the benefits of implementation of critical thinking classes in schools are clear. But what about some of the main counterpoints that may come to mind on the subject? Some of the most common arguments from those who are opposed to the integration of critical thinking classes in schools are those of resource allocation and standardized testing focus. For resource allocation, critics may argue that schools are stretched thin in terms of federal funding and time resources, and that adding critical thinking classes could strain these resources further. This point, although a valid worry, is not true when it comes to long-term results these curriculum changes would provide. The majority of a school's resources obviously go towards the management of its students, and of those students, the majority of the school's attention is required to be focused on the so-called bad kids, with the resource allocation following the 80-20 rule. 80% of a school's resources are focused towards 20% of its students. If critical thinking classes were taught in school, not only would the overall specific attention and care necessary to maintain detailed structure in every student's life decrease individually due to students being more independent, but the skills taught would lead to better decision-making from the 20%, meaning that in the end, a vast majority of schools would end up with fewer resources directed towards individual student management, and would more than account to what it would require to implement these new classes. Additionally, this issue ties into the ever-prevalent debate of school funding, wherein it is obvious that schools need additional funding in a complex academic environment, and the federal government or state mandate of critical thinking classes into the curriculum would necessitate the provision of additional funds and resources into each school by the government, just like what happens when any other class is added to schools, like geography or social studies. We've already determined that the implementation of these classes would result in less resource drain, so these classes being added and additional funding being allocated to schools while reducing the funds used by these schools would leave each school with a surplus of financial resources which could be put to good use, being reinvested into the schools. Another common argument against critical thinking classes is that of standardized testing focus. Some people argue that the current education system is designed to meet standardized testing benchmarks, which are primarily knowledge-based rather than skill-based, and that critical thinking and those critical thinking skills do not align with these benchmarks. I was surprised to learn that this was a serious counter-argument, as you can probably see why this is illogical. Standardized tests being based on the memorization of data rather than the real-world application of knowledge is not an argument against the teaching of real-world applicative knowledge, but rather an argument against standardized tests' ability and effectiveness in measuring students' performance properly. As we have explored today, the necessity for critical thinking in schools is undeniable. Implementing critical thinking into the core curriculum is not merely a pedagogical enhancement, it is a fundamental necessity for preparing students for the complexities of modern society and life in the adult workforce. Today, we've examined the misalignment between current educational practices and the real-world demands for critical thinking. We've seen how critical thinking can foster creativity, enhance decision-making skills, and prepare students for unforeseen challenges, as highlighted in the academic literature we reviewed and the sources we looked at. And we have invalidated most of the counter-arguments to critical thinking implementation that people who are opposed to the idea may try and use. Think of the last time you were faced with a difficult decision or a problem that didn't have a clear-cut answer. The skills to navigate such challenges are not innate, they're learned. And where better to learn them than in the schools that shape our future leaders and innovators? Let's recall the words from the analysis of critical thinking in education, highlighting that critical thinking fosters allied life skills such as organizational skills, planning, open-mindedness, communication skills, among others, by making sure every pupil should have an effective skill of critical thinking. These are not just academic competencies, they are the pillars upon which we can build a robust and dynamic future. So let's work towards a shift in educational priorities to embrace these crucial skills. As we stand on the brink of a future rich with potential, let us embrace our responsibility to ensure our students are not just prepared to face it, but are empowered to shape it. How long?